Welcome to the deep dive, where we take your sources and, well, turn them into synthesized insight. Today, we're kind of setting aside the usual rules, the accepted laws of the cosmos, and plunging into the excluded files of history. This deep dive is built around the sources you sent us, coming straight from Charles Fort himself, specifically parts of his big work, New Lands. Fort wasn't just collecting odd stories, he was almost a philosopher of scientific failure, maybe? Our mission today is to follow his method. He takes these facts that science rejected or ignored or maybe even suppressed, what he called the damned data, and he uses them to build this radically new and frankly kind of unsettling view of our existence, one that really shakes up conventional astronomy.
Yeah, and what's key to get right away is Fort's main critique. He calls it exclusionism. It's his idea that science systematically pushes aside or just buries any data that doesn't neatly fit the current theory.
So if a fact contradicts the accepted model, well, the fact gets thrown out, not the theory questioned. Okay, so if the dogma says Earth is isolated, spinning super fast, orbiting a sun millions of miles away, then any observation that hints otherwise, that maybe distances aren't fast or motion isn't that rapid, it must be wrong. Just like that.
That's the gist of it, yeah. Full stop. And in New Lands, Fort really goes after two specific pillars of that dogma. First, he tries to show how fragile some of astronomy's biggest wins actually are. And second, he piles up all these weird, localized things happening in the sky. Phenomena that, if you look at the geometry, they suggest Earth might actually be stationary.
Okay, let's dig into that. So Fort starts his attack not by arguing about, UFOs or something totally unknown, but by questioning the certainty of science itself. He uses astronomers' own history books against them, right? Arguing that a lot of celestial mechanics is more about explaining what we already see rather than predicting things perfectly beforehand.
Exactly. And the classic example, the one always held up, is the discovery of Neptune. It was hailed as this absolute peak of mathematical prediction. Proof that Newton's laws could pinpoint an unseen planet just from wobbles in Uranus's orbit.
Right, but Fort says, hold on, the actual calculation, it was kind of a mess.
Oh, it was definitely messy leading up to the actual finding. Fort points out the predicted orbital period from Leverrier, the French astronomer. It was somewhere between, 207 and 233 years? But here's the kicker. The actual observed orbit is only 165 years.
Wait, hang on. A difference of over 40 years in what's supposed to be a triumph of math. But,
Right.
okay, even if the math was messy getting there, they did find the planet. Doesn't that still prove the theory worked, more or less? Isn't Fort maybe nitpicking?
But that's Fort's whole point. He's not necessarily denying the planet exists. He's attacking the confidence, the narrative. That discrepancy, the 40-plus years, it was so big that astronomers in the U.S., initially they refused to accept Neptune, was found because of the calculation. They accepted the planet, sure, but not the story of flawless prediction. For Fort, that story is what he calls pseudo-life, a convenient fiction to keep up appearances, the appearance of being infallible.
Huh. So it's about maintaining the illusion of precision for the sake of the institution. And he sees this elsewhere, too, like with the scale of their formulas.
Absolutely. Astronomers claim they can competently model the whole solar system, all these planets, thousands of interactions. But Fort drags us back to something simpler. He points out they can't reliably solve the basic three-body problem. Sun, moon, Earth, gravity interactions.
Yeah, that's famously tricky.
Right. If you can't perfectly model just three bodies, how can you claim absolute certainty about formulas for the entire cosmos?
The confidence is the target. And this pseudo-life, this convenient narrative, it wasn't just in the math, it affected observations too, like with Procyon's companion star.
That's another great example. Otto Struve, the astronomer, he calculates Procyon must have an unseen companion. And he looks and boom, there it is, right where the math said it should be. Hailed as another big win for celestial mechanics.
There's a Fortean twist coming, right? The damned data that surfaced later.
Exactly. It turned out there was a defect found later in his telescope's lenses. And this flaw, it produced a similar fake companion star image about 10 inches from every large star he looked at.
Oh, wow. So the observation wasn't confirming the theory at all. It was just an instrument glitch that happened to match the prediction.
Precisely. Coincidence disguised as confirmation.
So what Fort's really getting at here isn't necessarily incompetence or fraud. It's more about, systemic self-preservation. Is that it?
That's largely his argument, yes. It's not usually malicious individuals. It's the system itself. These convenient narratives, this pseudo-life, it comes from wanting things to fit. The structure needs to hold. So anomalies get ignored, data gets fudged, maybe even unconsciously, just to keep the established model stable. Errors become near misses, not fundamental problems.
Okay, so if astronomy's bedrock is maybe built on some shaky ground, these convenient fictions, where else did Fort see the system failing? You mentioned he looked closer to home, down at our local sky.
It did. Moving away from the grand, distant heavens.
Yeah.
Fort collected thousands of reports, things happening right above us that just shouldn't be, according to the standard model.
Yeah.
Especially things falling from the sky and strange sounds that seem to defy a fast-moving Earth.
Right, he paints this picture of our atmosphere being sort of porous, constantly getting stuff dumped into it from outside.
Yeah, and he lists falls of things that are just impossible to classify conventionally.
The sheer weirdness is amazing. Okay, you've got records of black snow, red snow, pink snow, even jet black snow, but my favorite detail has to be the blue hailstones. And hailstones flavored like oranges. Seriously. Like, did someone actually taste them? That sounds almost made up.
Fort wouldn't care about the taste test. He cares that science just waves it away as unusual weather when it clearly seems like something else. He notes falls of stuff like punk, silk, charcoal, and those famous little round seeds in Germany back in 1822.
Oh, yeah, the ones people tried to cook.
Right, and boiling did nothing to them. They wouldn't cook. That resistance, that stubbornness of the data, that's pure 14.
It really highlights how absurd it is to try and neatly categorize everything. And it wasn't just small stuff falling, right? There were big objects, too.
Oh, yes. That sighting by the British steamer Patna in 1880, that's chilling. This enormous luminous wheel, maybe 500, 600 yards across, spinning next to the ship, on both sides, with spokes that seemed to almost brush the hull.
Wow, that's not some distant star. That's huge, local, and looks structured.
Exactly. But the data points that really push Fort towards his most radical idea, the stationary Earth idea, they come from phenomena that seem fixed in place, tied to specific locations on Earth over long periods.
Right, areas that just keep getting hit again and again.
This is where it gets really challenging for the standard model. He talks about Cymru in Scotland, a place known for repeated earthquakes since way back in 1788. But Fort digs up accounts linking these quakes to luminous objects seen in the sky during the events. Sounds like cannons firing. And critically, reports of black particles, like tiny bits of shot, falling onto laundry left out on the grass.
So what's he implying there? That it's not coming from underground?
His radical suggestion is, maybe these aren't earthquakes at all.
Yeah.
Maybe they're explosions happening in the sky directly above Cymru, explosions causing the ground to shake. And because they happen over and over for generations in the exact same place, the source must be fixed relative to Cymru, stationary above it.
Okay, wait, let me get this straight. If Earth is spinning at, 1,000 miles an hour at the equator and orbiting the sun at thousands of miles per hour, if something explodes in the sky right over Cymru, the next time that source is in the same position relative to the stars, Cymru itself should have moved thousands of miles away.
Right, that's the geometric problem. Precisely. If the Earth is moving that fast, having an event repeat in the exact same small town over and over for years, it's basically impossible. Unless the source is fixed and the Earth isn't moving much relative to it, or it's moving incredibly slowly, maybe inside some kind of shell.
A stationary Earth, or at least a locally contained one, and he found other examples of this repetition.
Yes. Those huge detonations in Melita in 1822, they lasted for days, and the sounds kept recurring intermittently for at least 3 years. Fort stresses it suggests something was specially related to this one small part of the Earth's surface. And Birmingham, England, May 1868, black stones falling in immense quantities, not just once, but repeatedly over several days, as if from some unknown region stationary above Birmingham. So if you connect the dots, the repetition, the extreme localization, these falls, sounds, concussions, that's the geometric contradiction Fort hammers on. The sources seem stationary, which forces you to consider his implication. Maybe the Earth is too. Stationary, or at least not hurtling through space like we think.
That geometric argument, that things happening repeatedly over the same spot imply a fixed source and a non-moving target. That leads right into Fort's biggest, most challenging idea, doesn't it? If these things are coming from fixed points in the local sky, then Earth isn't this isolated speck in a vast emptiness. We are, as Fort put it, possibly surrounded by nearby worlds, his new lands.
Right. He starts chipping away at the assumption of huge empty distances by looking at our closest neighbor, the moon. Conventionally, it's 240,000 miles away, about 2,000 miles wide.
But he thought the physical features we see didn't match that scale.
Exactly. He points to the moon's craters. Some are supposedly huge, 60, even 120 miles across. Compare that to Earth's biggest known impact or volcanic craters. Maybe 7 miles wide, typically much smaller. Fort asks, if the moon follows the same physical laws as Earth, why are its features so massively out of proportion to its size?
That's a really interesting point of comparison. So what's his explanation for that difference?
Fort suggests, well, maybe the moon isn't that size or that far away. If those features are proportionally similar to Earth's features, then the moon itself would have to be much, much closer and much smaller, maybe only 100 miles across, he speculates. He's arguing for a nearby moon. Not necessarily nearby in miles, but nearby in the kind of system we're in, meaning the official distances must be wrong.
And this idea of proximity of things being closer than we think, it's backed up by reports of possible signals, things that don't look natural.
Yeah, he highlights that recurring point of light seen flashing in the lunar crater Aristarchus. This wasn't just seen once. It was recorded first in 1821, seen again decades later, 1867, 1891. These persistent flashing lights. They suggest something deliberate, maybe. Activity from a fixed body really close to us.
And if things are fixed and nearby, then the idea of actual vessels, maybe even beings, visiting us, it starts to seem less impossible in Fort's view.
It becomes almost inevitable given his framework. He lists sightings of objects that seem structured, like that red body seen over Petworth in 1855. It had projections like spokes of a wheel, and it hung around for 90 minutes. That doesn't sound like a meteor or atmospheric trick. It sounds mechanical.
And objects crossing the sun, that seems like a place you'd spot things if they were between us and it.
Definitely. Fort loved those reports, especially because serious observers, even astronomers, made them. Carrington saw two star-like objects cross the sun in 1859. Sporer saw one in 1863. These things have to be relatively close between Earth and Sun, yet they're routinely dismissed as, well, more damned data, anomalies, mistakes.
So Fort looks at all this, the weird falls, the stationary sources, the lunar signals, the structured objects, and his conclusion is pretty staggering. Objects like ships from these new lands have actually been seen close to Earth. We're not remote, we're enclosed, maybe.
Right. And that brings up a really important question for you listening to this. Fort's work forces us to look beyond the weird events themselves and examine the process. How science decides what counts as knowledge, this exclusionism. Fort believed progress often comes by ignoring or explaining away data that makes the dominant theory uncomfortable, especially the theory that Earth is alone and isolated in vast space.
Yeah, these phenomena, the localized attacks, the weird stuff falling, the objects that seem fixed overhead, these are Fort's gnarled facts. The awkward data that exposes what he called the tyranny of false announcements from mainstream science. Fort really thought collecting all this damn data was pointing towards a totally new kind of astronomy, a neo-astronomy.
He had this wild idea that maybe our whole existence is contained within something like a giant cosmic egg, a super embryonic system, shielded perhaps for developmental reasons, but now maybe that shell is cracking. And the things he cataloged are glimpses of what's right outside, nearby worlds. And the localized nature of it all is key. We aren't moving away from these sources. They seem fixed. We're being bombarded, but in very specific, repeating ways.
Which leads us to a final thought for you to mull over. Building on that repetition, that geometric consistency, Fort highlighted those sounds heard over and over in Belgium between 1894 and 1896. Detonations, often in specific patterns, triplets, series. What if Fort was right? What if these localized repeating events, the sounds, the falls, weren't random? What if they were attempts to communicate?
Could it have been some kind of code? An ongoing message aimed at a world that just wasn't ready to listen? A world busy classifying it all as earthquakes or weird weather?
Maybe our current science, as Fort suggested, is just the unnoticed little clown in cosmic drama, completely missing the main act, waiting for the age of new lands to really begin. Something to think about. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.